April 12th, 2001. My name is Jerome Ferry. My cameraman is Alan Eggers. We're doing an oral interview with Liz Berry, who was a early aviator in Cedar Rapids at Hunter Airport. Liz, can you tell us when you were born and where you were born?
September 1921.
Whereabouts?
Cedar Rapids.
In Cedar Rapids?
I lived here all my life.
And what school did you go to here in Cedar Rapids?
I graduated from Franklin. At that time, it was 6 years. It was a junior high and a senior high. And then after that, I went to Carleton College and graduated there in 1943 with a degree in botany.
Mm-hmm. What did your dad do?
He sold insurance, and Mother was a stay-at-home mom. In those days, most of the women were.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. And do you remember the Depression?
Oh yes, I remember that.
Anything about it, or did it affect your family, or?
Well, I can remember once in a while some man would come by and he'd knock at the back door and he'd ask Mother if there was anything he could do around the house for a meal. And quite often we had a concrete bench out in the side yard, and quite often I can remember if a man came around like that, why she'd prepare a meal for him. He'd sit out there and eat his lunch, and maybe she had a little yard work for him to do or something.
Was he willing to do it? I mean.
Oh yes,
yeah.
yes, and in those days you weren't afraid. Today you would wonder if somebody came along wondering about that. You wouldn't be so happy to help them out. But in those days you would.
Yeah. Did you have a happy childhood?
Oh yes.
You had a
I
lot
had
of fun?
wonderful parents.
Yeah. What part of Cedar Rapids did you grow up in?
Well, not very far from here, right over on First Avenue, right across from 22nd Street. So this is part of the property that my dad owned. He had bought about 10 acres here, and then when they put in Washington High School, they put in this street, and he gave half of it, and then they named it for him.
Thompson Drive.
Mm-hmm.
What did you do as a young child for entertainment? A young girl.
Well, I was a tomboy. I played with the boys and girls of the neighborhood, and we climbed trees, and we built a tree house. This was all wild. There weren't any condominiums over there, and there were some big trees there, and we'd climb in those. We played baseball. At one time, the Dows owned that property, and they had cows there. And so we'd play around. We used cow pies, dried ones, for the base when we played baseball. And I played football until I was about 16. I played tackle football, and then Mother took me aside and told me I was too old to play tackle football with the boys. But I was quite a tomboy.
In being a tomboy, do you think maybe this is why all of a sudden you acquired an interest in aviation?
Might be. The first time I flew, I had been, after college, I worked at Dow Chemical Company in Midland, Michigan. And I decided, this was during the war, I decided to go into the waves. And so I applied for Officers Candidate School, and I went down to, from Midland, Michigan, I went down by train or bus to Detroit, to the office there. And coming home, that was kind of a long trip, so I found out that there was a charter airplane that would fly to Midland. So I went to the airport, and I rode, and I was the only passenger, so the pilot let me sit in front. I suppose it was about a 6 or 8 passenger plane, 2-engine. I just loved it. Well, I got released for my job in Midland, came home waiting for my orders to go into the Navy. And when they came, they were closing the Officers Candidate School. And by that time I was working for the Red Cross and the Home Service, and I decided not to, they said I could enlist, and I decided not to do that. So then I started taking flying lessons. I had just loved that trip from Detroit to Midland.
Did you, were you impressed with Amelia Earhart?
Not particularly. I don't think that had anything to do with my decision of doing it. I'd always wanted, well, for instance, the day I was 16, I got my driver's license. And then I just liked the idea of learning to fly.
And where did you take your training from?
Hunter Airfield.
You took your training from Hunter?
My instructor was a man by the name of Oscar Anderson.
Mm-hmm.
He was older. There was another instructor, I think Albert Fisher at the same time, but Oscar Anderson was mine.
Did they receive you quite well, or was there, back in those days, was there any such as sexual discrimination?
I never felt it if there was.
They seem to give you the same type of treatment they
Yes.
would given to a man.
They were very good.
Yeah.
Had me doing all sorts of things. I think I can remember practicing of course, the first landings were the kind where you kind of thumped down, and then he taught me the landings where you kind of came in smoother. What's interesting now is when I'm traveling, and I had a trip just this spring, and we came in one of the landings, and I turned to the person next to me and said, "Boy, that was hot." I mean, I can tell that now. Even this long afterwards, I can tell when the landing is a little bit different.
What do you remember? What did it cost you to take a lesson?
No,
back
I
then?
don't. The figure $15 comes to mind, but that seems a little high for that time. So I really don't know. And I don't know if I have any records of that or not. I know that when I worked in Midland, I had saved quite a bit of money, and I went through it all. So by the time I had started in about September, October 44, till the time I quit in April of 45, I'd spent all my money.
Well, in 44, how old were you? Would you have been in 44?
I would just have been 23. I was born in September.
What did your folks think of you?
I don't
Wanting
know
to
what
fly.
my dad thought. He probably was kind of proud of me. My mother told me later that every time I got in the family car to drive out to the airport, she wondered if she'd ever see me again. She was a worrier, and I didn't realize till later that I must have cost her a lot of worry.
We interviewed a gentleman last week that used to sell insurance to the early aviators and to their planes. Did you or your dad ever mention if you had insurance, you were covered when you flew?
I remember I had an insurance policy, and I had to sign something, or
A waiver.
Dad had to put that into the policy. Yes, I can remember that.
This Oscar Anderson, was he a very knowledgeable person? Did you think he was a good instructor?
Yes. The only time I had a close call was one time when I don't know if he had me piloting the plane or he was, but he came down kind of close to some trees in the farm, and I had to holler at him to get up. That's the only time I had a close call, but he was a very good instructor.
Is there anything in particular you remember about Hunter Field? Did it have any quirks, or was it easy to fly in and out of? Or
It was easy, and of course, in those days, it was all farmland around us. And I can remember very well off to the, it would have been to the east, there was a hill and a farm there. And of course, when you took off, you always wanted to be sure you got up well enough so you weren't too close to the land. And we could only fly so high, and then we had to stay at a certain altitude.
when you did get your license, was it the type of a license that you could take a friend up, or was it?
I didn't get a license. The reason I didn't, I had done everything necessary. I'd done the stalls, and I'm pretty sure we had to do spins then too. I'd done everything, and I'd had my solo flight over to Marshalltown, I think it was, to plot my, the way I was going, and I'd done everything, and then my husband came. He wasn't my husband then. He came home for about a week, and we started dating. And by the time he left to go back to his base and then to fly over to Tinian, he was a flight engineer on a B-29. We were engaged, so it was very kind of a whirlwind. But I'd gone through my money. I didn't have really any more money to spend on it. I knew that when I got married, I wouldn't be able to afford to fly. I would have to keep up in order to keep my license valid. So I stopped then. I haven't been sorry, because we got married as soon as he came back, and I have 2 sons now.
Mm-hmm. You mentioned that you did your solo to Marshalltown. Were you by yourself, or was?
Oh yes, I filed the flight plan, and did everything and flew over and landed, and then I checked in there so they'd know that I had, and then I came back.
Was any reservations about it, or were you comfortable doing it, or scared to death, or?
Oh, I don't think I was scared to death. I might have been a little apprehensive about it, because this is the first time that I would have flown that far alone. But I got along fine.
When you flew, did you fly if the weather was good?
Oh yes, I only flew when I could see the land. Of course, I didn't have any instrument, and I could only fly when the weather was good. One time when Don was here that week, we went out to he was quite intrigued with the fact that I was flying, so we went out to Hunter, and I went up on a plane by myself because I could solo, and he had flown, but he couldn't solo, so he went up with my instructor, and then there was a storm coming up, so we landed and got into the hangar. We were just waiting out the storm before we left the airport, and it was kind of a thunderstorm, but we got down and everything was fine. And while we were there in the hangar, the word came that I was wanted on the telephone. That was Mother. She was so afraid because the storm had broken and she knew we were flying. But we were down. Everything was okay.
Did you ever have the opportunity to meet Dan Hunter?
If I did, I don't recall
it. Got it. At the time you were taking your lessons, was there any other female?
There was one.
Women?
One was taking, and I think her instructor was the other man. But I'd see her out there, and we'd get together with a group of people. And of course, we just for the fun of it, we'd start talking about flying, and they'd watch. They were kind of interested in that, thinking we were crazy, probably.
You don't recall her name, do you?
Yes, it was Henrietta Dowse Arnold.
Oh,
She's
really?
no longer living. Mm-hmm.
Did she go on to get her license?
No, because Dwayne came back from service and she got married and she didn't fly anymore.
You said you never regretted not going on and getting your
No,
license?
I didn't, because I'd gone through money and I would have had to continue to fly some to keep the license up. Had I continued and not gotten married then and continued to fly, I would have gone on to get an instrument rating.
Did you have the opportunity to do much commercial flying?
I didn't have a commercial flight until 1977, when my husband and I took the flight to Turkey. My older son Don and his wife were over there teaching, and they lived in Turkey 7 years, so we had 2 flights over there. And the first flight, get on the plane here in Cedar Rapids. This is my first commercial flight, and I was sitting in the middle, down at the window, and there was a young woman at the aisle, and she was just sitting there reading. I thought at the time maybe she was very experienced about it, but thinking back, maybe she was scared to death, so she was reading. But anyway, we started up, and I turned to Don and I said, "Oh, this feels just like it used to." I enjoyed the flying. I don't like airports with the hassles of getting around, but I like flying.
Did your girlfriends at that time, did they think you were a little strange for wanting to do something so daring?
I think probably.
They probably wish they had had the nerve to do the same thing.
Maybe, to this day, friends are surprised when they hear that I took flying lessons years ago.
So tell us about your family, Elizabeth.
Well, I have 2 sons. Don is 53 now, and Steve is almost 49. And Don lives in Massachusetts. He teaches mathematics at Phillips Academy in Andover. And he's married to Roxy, and they have 3 children. Ivan is right now working in Istanbul, Turkey. And he actually was born in Turkey, and so was Heather, the next granddaughter. She's a senior at Goucher College, graduating this year. And then Kezi is 17, and she's a junior in high school, having a school year abroad in Spain. So I have the 3 grandchildren. Steve's only been married about 5 years, and he and Nancy don't have any children. And they live in Marion. They just got a new puppy, however, so they're having to get used to that.
Do you have any...
Well, I have a sister who is a few years younger than I am, lives here in Cedar Rapids, and we had a brother who passed away in 1975, and his wife is no longer living either, and they have 2 daughters. One lives in New York City, Nancy, and Cynthia lives in Cedar Rapids.
In taking your pilot's instructions, was there any book work you had to do, or was it pretty much hands-on type of...
Well, I had some information that I had to read, so I knew I knew what the regulations would be, how high up I could go, and when I could fly, when the weather was so that I could always see the ground, and how far down I could go. And I don't recall ever flying over the city. I think I was, if I had, I would have known at what height I had to be if I went over the city. When I'd get into the plane, the first thing we'd check all the equipment and make sure that the engine was ready to go, and I'd have to go through all that. I'd go out to the end of the runway, and then stop the plane, and then I'd have to check all that. Of course, at this time, I don't recall there ever being like a tower or anything, and of course, I didn't have any connection with anything anyway. And then my instructor had me go over everything, and then we'd put it up, and I was told at what speed I had to be before I could start lifting the plane up. And then we'd go up and fly, and I was just taught how to turn and all things like that. And then coming down for the landing. And the first landings I was taught was the kind where you go up and then just kind of bump down. And you tried not to be too high up when you bumped down. And then after I could get, so I could do that, sometimes it'd be just going up and flying around and coming down again, testing landings. Then he taught me to make a smoother landing. And I got so that I could do that pretty well. And then I just progressed. Then I was led through stalls, learning to stall, and then we discussed if I'd had to have a forced landing, how I would come down. And then after a while, then I'd had enough of that, then he certified me to solo. And of course, the first day up by myself, you're a little apprehensive. Here I am going up, nobody with me to help. But I really enjoyed it.
Elizabeth, you had mentioned earlier that your husband had some flight experience too. What did he do in the service?
Well, the flight experience, I think he had when he was going to school out at University of Colorado. I think he took some lessons then, or it may have been when he worked in Seattle. He worked for Boeing aircraft. Then he decided, this was during the war, he wanted to get into the service. So he went into the Air Corps. He got out of his job at Boeing and went into the Air Corps and was a flight engineer on the B-29. He had had some flying experience, but he'd never soloed. And of course, he didn't fly the plane on the B-29, but he had all this. He rode backwards and had all this panel of all these instruments that he had to watch for the engines. But he came back in. We got engaged in spring or summer of '45. And then he was over in Tinian for a year, and then the war ended, and he was in Tinian, then he was in the Philippines, and then he came back in April of '46, and we were married in May of '46.
Did he ever mention being on any bombing runs?
Yes, he had some. Mm-hmm. He had some over to Japan, but he was not involved in the dropping the atomic bomb, but it was there on Tinian.
Really?
And they knew there was something on Tinian that was kept under a canvas someplace on the island, and everybody was forbidden to be there. So they knew something was going on, but until it was dropped, they didn't know. They didn't know what was on there. He enjoyed the flying. He flew so much, and when we'd get on a commercial flight, if he heard one little noise or something seemed different, he'd say, "What was that? Did you hear that?" Of course, that made me feel really good. I sometimes think he did it to tease me.
Liz, the History Center wants to thank you very much for sharing your memories with us, and we hope you enjoy a long and very healthy life.
Well, thank you
very much.
Thank you.